Let's have just a 1 minute of review to get your mind thinking in the vein I would like it to be thinking in, sort of foundational to set the foundation of what we're looking at. We're still looking at the combined statement of financial position, but this video will be completely different. In a sense, we have explained the things that are on here to the extent that I'm going to for a while. We will have more videos on some of the details, but right now, as an overview, we have covered the statement of financial position. And one important concept is that we have established the concept of current assets versus non-current assets and current liabilities versus non-current liabilities. And we have established the concept of allocated functions. Okay, it looks as if I'm just grabbing things out of the air here, but basically I have a purpose for all of this. So current assets, let's just make sure we're clear on the definition of current assets, current liabilities, and allocated functions. Current assets are assets that are available for the current issues I am facing. My ability to survive 12 months, my ability to handle emergencies, my ability to take new initiatives, uh, and my ability to pay off my current liabilities. Okay, I think I covered all four of those. All right, so those are what current assets are, and the first thing we come to is that we're going to use current assets to pay off our current liabilities. Okay, so the concept of current assets minus current liabilities is the title of that in business and everywhere in the commercial world is working capital. Current assets minus current liabilities is referred to as working capital. So these are the resources that are available to face the future. The first stumbling block it runs into is that some of them have to be used to pay off current liabilities. So the 21 million minus the 8 is my working capital. The church has a policy that describes how much working capital an organization should have. Now, this has become a very important measurement that leadership uses in evaluating the organizations that they're responsible for. It is a quick indicator of how much trouble the organization is in right now. How do we stand right now in our current position? So the first thing in our calculation, and we're going to go through it conceptually, and then I will show you the calculation, is that we take our current assets and subtract our current liabilities, and we get our working capital. And then we look at what is recommended for us to have. On all of the recommendations, we should have enough to cover our allocations. Okay, our allocations. So I'll circle back to this later. So we have our current assets. The first burden that encounters is the current liabilities, and that gave us, I don't know, whatever that number is there, 12,000, something like that, left over in working capital. Well, the first thing that we have to think about is that of that 12 million, 7 million of it is needed for our allocated functions. We have said we're designating this current assets to this current project, and that's what we did when we allocated it. Okay. And the second part of the working policy about it is that you are supposed to have a certain percentage of your operating expenses. Okay, so if you go down into your operating statement, we haven't really worked with it so much, but we have our operating expenses for the past period. We should have a certain percentage of that also. Okay, so without any further to do here, let's just jump over and look at the policy. So I'm going to the GC working policy, and it's a big black book, and everyone should have one, and all financial leaders or all leaders should know what it says about the financial policies because All the leaders, the president, the secretary, and the treasurer are all responsible for compliance. And the first thing it says, it talks about working capital. And the policy comes a little short of saying that it is required, like you're in big trouble. Basically, working policy, if you've got money saved up for emergencies, and an emergency happens and you drop below the policy requirement, that's the way it's supposed to work. Okay, you've saved up for an emergency and a recession comes and you weather the recession because you had enough saved up, then that's the way it's supposed to be happening. And so the idea that you will never go below policy requirements is not so much the issue, is that you're during the good times, you're bracing for the bad times. So when the bad times come, and maybe I will pause on that thought for just a second. Recessions and economic downturns are not emergencies. They always have happened. Right now, worldwide, I know every country is different, but the United States is on a 10-year run. Australia is on something like a 50-year run or something where they haven't had a recession, but they always come. It's like your tires wearing out on your car. Your tires wearing out on your car is not a family emergency. They were wearing out you knew they were going to wear out, and so you should have been saving up for those tires. And the same sort of thing works with working capital. Most recessions, we're not talking about great, horrible things. Most recessions reduce your income by, say, 10% off of what it used to be, and it can be a decline of 10 or 15%. And if you've got the working capital saved up, you're not having to lay people off. Most of your income is going to salaries, and so this working capital requirement is really an employee protection policy. It's not an organizational protection policy. You can always save the organization by firing a bunch of people. The working capital policy is really about protecting and showing true care and love for your families, that or your workers' families. So when there's a downturn, you can continue making payroll. They can continue to be working in the church, and you weather through the recessions. So usually they're about a decline of about 10% off of the high, and they usually last 2 or 3 years. And so this working capital provision gives you some sort of cushion to help you weather them. The first thing you do is that you go down and you find your organization. The higher in the organizational structure you are, the more working capital you're expected to have. And that is because of appropriations. So the divisions are depending on the general conference appropriation, the unions are depending on the division appropriation. So they're expected to have more. The union needs to keep 30% of its latest fiscal year's operating expenses, or for interim statements, the latest 12 months operating expenses. That's sort of policy gobbledygook. If they just said 12 months, the last 12 months actual operating expenses, they would be the same difference. Okay. But in any case, so the union has to keep 30% plus its allocated funds. Conferences keep 20% plus its allocated funds. And so let's just go through this. We have unions, 30% plus allocated, conferences, 20% plus allocated, and then university colleges and junior colleges, 20% plus allocated. Okay. Academies, 15% plus allocated. Oh, excuse me, there's no allocated in the academy. All right. So you get the idea. Just now that we know the jargon, let's go back to the union and use that as our class example. The union is 30% plus it's allocated. All right, so we can come back over here. We have the working capital of 21,018,581, current assets minus current liabilities, right here, of 888,52,959, and that's its working capital. Does it have enough working capital? It's supposed to have 30% of its operating income and enough to cover its allocated. So this calculation is done in the financial statements back here in the, let me just scroll back. It's back here in the back of the financial statements. All of them have it. It's a church requirement. If your financial statements don't have it, then you are out of policy. Okay. So let's go through it. The 24 million, 018,581 minus the 8,852,959 current liabilities gives us a working capital of 15,165,622. This is after paying your liabilities, what you have for emergencies, current operations, is what you have for planning and initiatives. Do you have enough? You're supposed to have 30% of your operating expense and all of your allocated, and this is your recommended working capital of 11 million. And so you have 4 million extra. Okay, so in this example, there's 15 million and you needed to have 11 and you have 4 million extra. And so you have 136%. That is 15 million divided by the 11 million. You have 136% of what you're supposed to have. So if you have above 100, then everything is fine. You are meeting the minimum suggested working capital. If you're below 100%, then you are short. All right. And so if you're short, then you are jeopardizing your families because the emergency comes along. All you can do is lay people off. Now, how can you start fixing this problem? How can you start fixing the problem? Well, first off, the first way you fix it is you've got to start operating at a surplus. That's the way you build your working capital. You bring it just like in your family, you bring in more than you're spending. So in the years in which you budget and you have a bonus year and you bring in more than you budgeted, then you don't change the budget and spend the surplus. You take that money and build up your working capital with it. One way that some organizations do it, it's a little of a shell game, but it's still okay, is that they actually budget what they label as an expense of increase in working capital to help them with the balanced budget. Okay. But in however way you put it together, the only way you build working capital is to spend less than you're bringing in or bring in more than you're spending. Okay, however way you can figure that out. So if you're below 100%, you've just got to change your wicked ways and start bringing in more than you're spending. There is one thing or a couple things that we need to just acknowledge. One of the things that hurts working capital percentage is allocated net assets. If you look at the policy governing allocated, you're not allowed to allocate if you don't have more than 100% working capital. That is, if you don't have excess working capital, you're not supposed to allocate. So anytime you're below 100% of the working capital, you have less working capital than the requirement. It is against policy to allocate. I will tell you that if you're allocating and you don't have the working policy, you're just playing a game anyway. You're saying these resources are for this special project when in fact you don't have the resources. Well, the opposite of what I just said is true. If you allocate, it hurts your working capital. If you are in a bad working capital position, having allocated net assets is really right at the edge of dishonest. You might want to unallocate those net assets. You say you have put aside money for evangelism of the Igbo in southeast Nigeria, when in fact you don't have any money to put aside. So you ought to unwind that. Oh, we've saved this money. We have this allocated net assets for a new building. Well, if you're below your working capital percentage, you really don't have any money there. There's no money backing up the allocation. It's just a sham almost. So you ought to vote to unallocate the net assets. So one nice professional way to solve a working capital problem is to review your allocations and unallocate them because they're not really viable if you're below 100% or if they're making you go below 100%. And so that's the working capital calculation. And I believe it's one of the most important calculations that every church leader should understand well. It's very important. It's not just policy, it is a very strong indicator of how well you're going to be able to handle the next emergency or the next downturn. It is also positive. It's not just about bad things. You need to have a certain amount of working capital so you can take care of strategic opportunities that come along. Some quick decision comes along where you can buy a building or buy a church or start a evangelism because the field is opening up, and if you've got enough working capital there, you're ready to make a move. So the church considers this very important and urges you all to make sure that you understand this calculation and that you follow, you prepare it and you monitor it well in your committees. Thank you. I'll see you next time.